All right, so here we are. I'm going to talk to you today about natural law, just war theory. This lecture was originally given at the University of Southern California to the ROTC program there for midshipmen. Those are Marines and Navy officers to be, and so this would be very important to them. So when I talk to them, I was talking about natural law in general and how it applies to the just war of engaging in war, and how we should conduct ourselves when we actually are in war. We could apply this to specific wars, and we could conjecture about future wars too, once we know this. And keep in mind, remember, our country, the founding principles, at least originally, were on natural law. And so natural law existed prior to our country. We adopted it. This goes all the way back to Augustine. So it comes from the Christian tradition in many regards. So why don't you give me another slide here. And let's read our Declaration of Independence, where it says, in Congress, July 4th, 1776, if you didn't know when we declared independence from where?
British.
England, yes. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. You will note that it is not a uppercase United, because it was not really seen as the singular United States of America, but the states who are what? United in a cause, but they were united in one thing. They said, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. He goes on to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's an epistemological claim. He's not saying these truths are scientifically discovered. He's saying they are self-evident, that all men are created, emphasis on the created, equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. For something to be unalienable means you cannot take it away from something and it still be the same thing. For example, you cannot take away the fourth side of a square and it still be a square. He's saying we cannot take these rights away from humans. It is part of their nature, and to do so would be to deny their humanity. So he's saying that we have certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is happiness? We'll discuss that in a bit. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, what does end mean? It has to do with that Greek word telos, which has to do with design. What are governments designed to do? They are designed to secure these rights, right? And so when they become destructive of the design to protect and secure these rights with which we are naturally endowed, he says it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government, to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as they shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So what are governments for? To secure rights. Do governments, according to this, do governments create rights?
No.
They do not create rights. So you ladies, did you have the right to vote, or did men give you the right to vote?
She had.
If by nature we have certain rights that are unalienable, and that would mean men didn't give women the right to vote. That meant men oppressed women in a way. And so in this case, it was destructive to the ends, right, of liberty. So what did we do? We altered the Constitution. We made an amendment. In fact, This was written, and what was the first constitution of our nation called? The Articles of Confederation. And that was inadequate. It wasn't working. And so what is the preamble of the Constitution? What are the first words of the Constitution? What do they say? Yes, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Well, more perfect than what? Than the one they had with the Articles of Confederation. So they altered or abolished it because that form of government was not really working to secure the rights of man adequately. So what happened during the Civil Rights Movement? We altered what was going on in our nation so that people's rights that were being trampled on, because they had these unalienable rights, we altered it. We didn't abolish our Constitution, we just altered it in a way to do what? Make sure it did what the Constitution is supposed to do, secure the rights of man. So the big thing is, according to natural law, these rights come before the government. These rights exist apart from the Constitution. One of the biggest arguments when they were talking about a Bill of Rights for America is that people were worried that if you put these things in writing, there are people who are going to believe that these are your only rights because we wrote them down, and if they're not written down, you don't have any more rights. Now keep in mind, the Declaration of Independence came before our Constitution, right? Now we want to know, are the claims being made in the Constitution correct? Well, if natural law is correct, perhaps so. So Thomas Jefferson, where did he get this stuff from? Because he got this from John Locke, and this traveled from John Locke. Prior to him would be people like Thomas Aquinas, and prior to Thomas Aquinas, who adopted Aristotle. We're talking, this line of thinking goes all the way back to the ancients. So he's going to use terms that would have been familiar and spoken about by the ancients. For example, happiness. What is happiness? Happiness is highly discussed in the book, The Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. And he discusses happiness in terms of ends. What are ends? That comes from the Greek word telos, and it has to do with the design. For example, these glasses in my hand have an end. What are they designed for?
See better.
To see better, and these are reading glasses, so they are specifically geared for me to not only see better, but specifically to read, right? So my eyes, they help my eyes do something, right? My eyes are designed for something, correct? And what are those for? Seeing, right. And so Aristotle argued that everything has a purpose, a higher order, this end, and we need to fulfill that end. And he would suggest we desire all things for something else, but there's one thing that we desire for itself, and we call that happiness. And Aristotle would argue that people disagree about what happiness is, but they often confuse it with three things: health, wealth, and honor. And we'll throw a fourth thing on there that he says, which is pleasure. Now, I've asked you guys, do you want money? And you go, yeah, money sounds great, right? And it does. But we don't want money, wealth, for itself, do we? What do we want money for? For what it gets. And so we want money for the cars, and we want the cars for the experience, for the girls that will pick up, for whatever. We want the house for the shelter, maybe to raise a family. And you can see these are instrumental goods. They are good for something, and we want them for not for themselves, but for something else. They are not happiness. The same thing is true with honor. We want people to like us and give us nice things, but we want that for a reason. And sometimes people can withhold these things, and if they can withhold them, then certainly happiness is outside of our reach and out of our control. Pleasure. A lot of us pursue pleasure thinking it's happiness, take drugs, lead promiscuous lifestyles, and is that happiness? It is pleasure, but is pleasure happiness. If you're doing drugs, you are actually destroying your body. Perhaps the promiscuous lifestyle destroys not only your body in some ways, but it may destroy your ability to have relationships. And perhaps we are designed to have relationships in a certain way, and if you're a promiscuous person, it destroys your ability to do so. Make sense? All right, so happiness has to do with somehow fulfilling our telos and living a life of virtue, according to Aristotle. Now, how does one determine what the virtuous act is, according to Aristotle? He uses what's called the golden mean. The golden mean is to take an act to excess or deficiency, and we will call those two extremes vice. For example, let's take the virtue of bravery, and let's take the excess, and we'll call that rashness, a guy who just runs into danger without considering the cost to himself. That would be rash. He's overly brave. People, maybe cliff diving and, wait to, base jumping, wait to the last second, pull the parachute. Maybe it'll open, maybe not. They're just there to get the rush. They may be a bit rash. But what about the deficiency of bravery? What would we get? Cowardice. And we're talking about people who, they'd be sucking their thumb in the corner even if they are justified and expected to act in a certain manner. Imagine the intruder comes into the house, he's got your wife and daughter, and you're over there sucking your thumb in the corner because you're just paralyzed, you can't do anything, right? And instead of helping your family, which you may be morally obligated to do, instead you bravely run away. As Maverick's pappy always said, run today, live to run another day, right? Now, that's cowardice. So you've got the deficiency on one hand, you've got the excess on the other, and then you've got what's called the mean, the golden mean, that which is not deficient and not excessive. You act appropriately for the action. And we could use this in several different areas of our lives, and that's just one of the areas in which Aristotle discussed determining virtuous acts. Okay. Now, for the happy person, they want to be virtuous. They want to act in accord with reason. How did we determine that? We didn't have a book tell us this, did we? We can use our reason, our own mind, to discover this. We can see that my eyes have a design, right? And from that design, I could say what the purpose is, and if I act in accord with that purpose and do not violate it, and if I fulfill what it is designed for, then I am acting with reason and acting towards happiness. Now, let me ask you a question. What is a human? Let me go back. What's a mechanic? One who does what? Repairs cars, or maybe he could be a mechanic, some kind of computer repairman, and then what do? They repair computers. How do you know if you have a good mechanic? Your car runs, okay? How do you know if you have a good computer? You get all the spyware off and all that stuff. Your computer runs well. How do you know if you have a good doctor? He cures your ailments, right? How do you know if you have a good diet? The result is health, right? Okay, fine, that's great. Now, we know you have good doctors, good mechanics. We know you have good dog walkers. If they walk the dog, they pick up the poop. We know there's a design and some way to fulfill that design, right? So, what is a human? What kind of thing are we that makes us good? What is a good human? What does it mean to function well as a human? Well, yeah, Aristotle would say we are political by nature, meaning we hang out in the polis, which means a city like Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Metropolis, We hang out with each other. Great. That's one thing we do. That's descriptive. But what makes us good? And to be good means you function well. So what would a good functioning person be? What do we do that animals don't do? Yeah, there we go. That's where we are. We reason. And we reason towards virtue. Animals don't think about these things. The shark will forcibly copulate with another shark, and he's not going, oh, I feel so guilty about what I did, and the shark police aren't after them. Humans reason, and we reason even about our own thoughts. Okay? The dog's not sitting there. My own dog sits there, chews up all my papers. He literally ate your tests. And so, dog ate your homework. And so, do you think the dog is sitting there going, I really feel bad about that? No, the dog thinks, eat tests, get squirted with a water bottle. Right? That's all he thinks. Can you turn that off? So, to fulfill our function, we want to function well by reasoning well. We want to reason towards virtue, and that's kind of how Aristotle did it. So this is going to find its way all the way into our Declaration of Independence and this concept of happiness here. So this is what we've got. All right, next slide, if you will. So there is a claim, though, contained in this, in that which we have received from Thomas Jefferson, from John Locke, from Thomas Aquinas. We have inherited this. We have inherited the notion in our government that if there is a God, then there is, if there is no God, then there is no endowment with rights. But if there is a God, there is an endowment with rights.
What's endowment?
Well, God has created us in such a manner in which you have been created with something. Okay? You were created as such, and so you are endowed with this. It's part of what you are, okay? So if there is no God, then there is no endowment. You've been given no rights by God, right? So if there, but if there truly are rights, then there is a God. But by rights, you would mean things with which we've been endowed, things that come as part of our nature. All right, so let's go with our next slide. So the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the ones he makes a claim. We have three major rights, and from these we get what are called tertiary rights, rights that come from these. If you have the right to life, you have a right to defend your life. Would you not agree? So if I have been designed to live, I've been endowed with that right. It is part of my telos, my design. I am a living being, and that's what my design is to do. My design is not to cease to live, but it is to maintain my life. Now, that would mean I also have an obligation to live, but others would have an obligation to not kill me, and I would also be justified in defending my life or others' lives if they were to try to take them from me or from others. So, these are the rights to life, the right to liberty. Slave rebellions were justified. Why? Because it's part of your endowment that if this is taken from you, you have a right to defend your liberty. Now, with that being said, the same thing is true with happiness. Nobody has a right to tell you, no government can say you have a legal obligation to do an immoral act, because happiness requires virtue. If happiness requires virtue, and the government says you have a right to happiness, they can't then come along and say, you have a moral right to violate somebody else's rights themselves. All right, let's go. Now, by the way, this concept right here can also justify people's dissent when it comes to war. There are conscientious objectors who say, I believe all killing is wrong because people have the right to life, and I cannot be obligated to take the innocent's life, and thus the government has no right to force me to do this. Now, of course, because we're applying this to just war theory, there are times when we're going to argue that the government may be justified in using force and conscripting people to take other people's lives. All right, okay, here we go. So there's a distinction between the natural law and the positive law. what I have been describing is the natural law. The natural law is a set of moral realities based on design that exist independently of governments. If there are no governments that create laws in writing, the natural law still exists. Just as the natural law of gravity exists, so too does the natural moral law that thou shalt not rape also exists. That is just as much a moral reality as the laws of physics are a reality, okay? So if there's no government, it doesn't mean that these laws don't exist. And that was the claim that Thomas Jefferson was making. They had a government above them, the King of England, and they were saying this king is violating the natural law and is judged by it. Thus, we can alter or what? Abolish it. Very good. And so, this is a law above the written law. This is what we judge laws according to. Let me give you an example. Texas law, well, let's forget that. I was going to go with Lawrence v. Texas, but that's a different one. But what about Rosa Parks? There was a law that said Rosa Parks could not sit in a certain part of the bus, right? And so she broke the law. Did she really break the law? She broke a law. She broke what's known as the positive law. The positive law is the law that man writes. And sometimes the positive law is based on moral law. And so we have good laws. And if you have a law that corresponds with the natural moral law, it's not a violation of that, then you have a good law. But what was wrong with Rosa Parks? That law forbade black people to sit in certain areas, and thus they did not have liberty. They were certainly not treated as equal. And so according to the natural law, that law was judged and found to be guilty. And so we judge the written law by the natural law. But remember, if there's no natural law, then all we have is the positive law. And then we have a problem. All right, next slide. Well, the 13 colonies, they declared their independence from England by appealing to this law above the king. They gave their reasons, and then they justified killing over it. Now think about this. I've often asked, if natural law is not true, then was the Revolutionary War justified? Because I mean, really, what was the big complaint of the colonies against the king?
Taxes.
Taxes. So we had a bunch of tea partiers there saying we want to separate from you over taxes. No taxation without representation, right? And there were some atrocities that I think happened, I guess. We got a massacre here and there. And so around 1775, we get the Marine Corps being formed in a bar, which is very nice. And, we're starting to create militias. Why are we creating militias? Because they have a right to protect their liberty. If you have a right to protect your liberty, then you must need weapons to do so. And who are you going to protect it from? The government that you feel is tyrannical. And what is tyranny? Tyranny is the unjust rule of whomever's in government. A tyrant is the unjust rule of the one. Oligarchy is the unjust rule of the few. And according to Aristotle, democracy of all things is the unjust rule of the masses. He called it tyranny of the masses. He'd call polity the just rule of the masses. So hopefully in America we could achieve polity, the just rule of the masses. All right, let's go with the next slide. So when Aristotle speaks of happiness, he speaks of in terms of natural law. Paul, the apostle, which many of our founders were Christians, many, not all. Jefferson wasn't a Christian, he was a deist. But Paul spoke of God revealing his will through his creation, which is consistent with the natural law. Thomas Aquinas, the Christian, says he develops natural law theory in which he states that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. So you could see the strong connection between natural law and what's called theism, or at least a minimal form of deism. The difference between theism and deism is this. Theism believes that God has not only created the world, but that he interacts with his creation, and that in some instances has given what's called special revelation. Christians, Jews, Muslims would recognize that type of stuff as scripture or speakings of through prophets. But deism is really merely just a modest claim that there is a God who exists, that did create the world, and who really doesn't have his hands on it yet. He may sustain it as a reality that exists, but that he really is not as interested. But there is a moral law that is part of nature, and that was really what Thomas Jefferson believed. That's not to say he didn't value the teachings of Jesus. He had his own Bible. Next slide, please. So like all the rest of creation, man is destined by God to an end. What do we mean by an end?
Design.
Design, thank you, very good. And he receives from him, that would be God, a direction towards this end. We use our reason to know what it means to be a high-functioning human through virtue, and we can choose to pursue this or not. Next slide, please. So these actions which conform with these tendencies that telos lead to our destined end, right? And thereby constituted right and morally good. So if you fulfill your telos, your design, and act virtuous, we call that good. But those which deviate with our nature are wrong and immoral. And this is really the claim about sex. For example, pedophilia. Does that conform to what our body is supposed to do? For example, what is sex for? What are your sexual organs for? If your eyes are for what? Seeing, and your ears are for hearing, and your stomach's for digestion, your lower digestive tract is for digestion. Well, then what about a man and a little boy? Does that fulfill the design of those particular parts of the body? No, it does not. And thus, it would deviate from the nature or the design of the body, and thus you call that morally bad. Now, that says nothing about appetites. People may have appetites. Look, I love Banana Foster. Okay, that's great stuff. And if my wife brings a whole pie of Banana Foster home, heaven forbid, it's like $5 in a 13-year-old's pocket, it's got to go. I will take that Banana Foster down, and you might as well just paste it right on my belly, because it's not good for me. So in a way, I'm deviating with my appetite, right? It can't be controlled by my appetite. So even if an old man has an appetite for 10-year-old girls, should he follow it? No, it deviates from the design. So our reason tells us to follow the design, not our appetites. And so when we look at our men will have appetites to cheat on their wives, or wives will do the same, should they do it? Is that the design of a marriage? No, it destroys the marriage. And if it's destructive to the design of marriage, then it must not be good. Okay, and so we can see through natural law, we don't need somebody to say, thou shalt not cheat on your wife, thou shalt not have sex with little boys. We can know this through reason. All right, so we can apply this to all sorts of things. Unfortunately, a lot of our appetites will be disappointed, because that will tell people they can't follow their appetites. And thus you can see why natural moral law becomes very controversial. All right, next slide, please. So the natural law is universal, and that is to say that it applies to the entire human race, and it's in itself the same for all. So just because some other cultures practice something else, it doesn't follow that they are right. And just because we practice it here, it doesn't make it right. We want to know if it fulfills a natural moral law. So just because there's sleep, you've heard your sociology professor say, well, there's different morals in different parts of the world, right? Well, the natural moral law says, yeah, there's different moral practices, and some whole cultures violate the natural moral law and thus are immoral. For example, take Nazi Germany. They practiced eugenics. They practiced euthanasia of an entire, almost entire race of people. They were committing genocide. I have this book here, From Darwin to Hitler, where Hitler was employing Darwinian ideas with the intent of human experiment, the ridding of those undesirable people in society, and to cleanse our race. And he was using these ideas to do that. Should we accept that this is okay because it was just part of their culture? Well, if the natural moral law is true, if this type of behavior is wrong in America, then it must also be wrong in other places, even if they accept it. All right, let's go with the next slide. So positive law may not ordain anything contrary to the natural law from which it draws its authority. And again, we'll go back to Rosa Parks. Just because the natural law said something otherwise, and Rosa Parks was saying, no, this violates the natural moral law. It is right for me to be here, and it is wrong for you to have this law that says I cannot. And so the positive law may not ordain anything contrary. Just because it's written in law by man does not make it true. Hopefully, man writes it because it is true, but just because he doesn't make it true. All right. Next slide, please. All right, so here when we start getting to just war theory, there are two concepts. Imagine, we are in a world today where there are people who do not like America, and there are people who do not like other countries. Now, a lot of people say we shouldn't get into other people's battles. We shouldn't worry about the Middle East. This is a big fight amongst Iran, amongst Iraq, the Sunnis versus Shiites, or we could go to any other country, and a lot of people would say we should just stay out of it. The question isn't whether or not we can stay out of it, or should say, can we get involved in it? That's one issue. Another issue is, what about our enemies? Are we allowed to engage with our enemies? Should we? This is a yes, we can. We certainly have the ability to do so. So imagine some of you guys are in your 20s, men, and we are going to want you, sir, to carry a weapon and go kill some people. Should we not first justify doing that? And if we do, how do we do it? Well, if we do it just the positive law, we just write into action and go, right? But if we're going to appeal to a higher law, we'll appeal to the natural law. And we're going to ask two questions. One, is this war justified? And two, how we engage this war, how we fight it, are we just as we do it? Okay, for example, we have two terms here. Jus ad bellum, the justice of war, and we have jus in bello, the justice in war. The first one justifies war in general. We want to know, can we go to war here and kill some people, remove a government and replace it with another government with the hopes of replacing an unjust government with a just government? So let's go to the Iraq War, George Bush Jr.'s war, not George Bush Sr.'s war. Let's take George Bush Jr.'s war. Were we justified in going in and taking out Saddam Hussein's government and replacing it with another government with the hopes that that government would do what? Secure the rights of the people that naturally exist? Were we justified in doing that? So what would the criteria be? We need to have some criteria. Why don't you give me another slide here? So there are three core criteria of a just war. We first must have a just cause. We must have a proper authority. For example, I can't just say on my own, come on guys, we're going to go to war. I'm going to create my own militia group, my own private army, and go wage war with other countries. Why? Because I am not a proper authority. I am not recognized. as having the position in order to do something. Because if I did it privately, that I could be waging war on all sorts of arbitrary instances. All right? And finally, we must have the right intention. And what should our intentions be when we go to war?
Good.
Good. Well, I hope we have some good intentions. But what would it mean to have good intentions? First of all, what is the goal of war? I heard a comedian say not too long ago, waging war for peace is like having sex for virginity. Okay? And that sounds pretty odd, right? Great way to sell it. And that would show that war cannot be justified if you're justifying it on the grounds of peace. If we're doing that. But is that what one would justify war? I mean, how they would justify it? What is the goal of war? Victory. Victory. We go to war to take out a government, usually, okay? Then we replace that government. The replacing of the government, now that, the intent of that is to create a just society. Our goal, ultimately, is to take out an unjust government and replace it with a just government. Now, what if we just walked in and took out, all of Saddam's guys, basically put their hands in the air, said they give up. And maybe there are a few skirmishes, right? And so we walk in, we take over, and it's a pretty easy war, about 96 hours, correct? Pretty easy. Low death toll. Okay, good. And then we erect a new government, and now it works generally okay, we'll say. It could be better. Okay, but what if we went in and said, okay, look, we don't want to risk any of our guys at all. So we got a way of doing this. What we'll do is we're just going to drop a nuclear weapon on Saddam's hometown, wherever he is, okay? Let's say he was in Baghdad. We know he's in Baghdad. So we're going to send out, we've got all these old MX missiles. We'll shoot one over the polar ice caps, get it right to Baghdad, take Baghdad out. We know the government's gone. That's where it was, right? Saddam's gone. And now we'll send in some people, say we'll erect a new government there. One, did we have the right intention? Well, we had the right intention for victory, but did we, when it comes to justice in war, did we fight our war fairly? Many would say no, right? This could be another slide here. We get other things. There's secondary core conditions. One, we should try to refrain from going to war by all means, but once it becomes inevitable, once diplomacy has reached its end, the last line of diplomacy, unfortunately, is war. It's just kind of like at our voting booth. Well, let's take the abortion issue. At the end of the day, you can sit there and reason with people either way, and the two sides aren't going to budge. So how do you determine it? At the voting booth. And once the voting is in, it becomes law and it's enforceable by government. So unfortunately, when you're dealing with countries and you don't deal with voting that way, what you do is you end up using your own weaponry against their weaponry. It's a last resort, and we call that the last line of diplomacy is war. So the second one of those is we must have a reasonable chance at success. So why go to war if you don't think you can win it, right? Unless it's a defensive war and they're going to annihilate you, right? Imagine they're going to commit a genocide, they're coming for us. It's our last resort, we got to do it. Even if we don't have a reasonable chance at success, we've got to defend ourselves, right? But in normal circumstances where we would send our troops overseas, we want a reasonable chance at success. This is the one where we drop a missile on Baghdad, a nuclear weapon, that proportion. Natural law says we must be just, and what is justice? Justice is equals being treated equally and unequals being treated unequally, right? You have to be proportionate. You don't sit there and say, it would only take 50,000 troops to move in and take out the government, or one MX missile, which will kill 200,000 people in one shot, and then probably another 300,000 through the radiation. You see the proportionality there, right? And that's why we have Lady Justice there holding up the scales. Peace. has to be the ultimate aim. Now, remember when I said the goal of war is not peace, right? The goal of war is victory, to remove government. The ultimate aim, though, at the end of it is there's a bigger picture, and that this is just a tool in that bigger picture to restore justice. And from justice, we get peace. Peace is the natural outcome, result of a just society. So could you have, is peace, the question here is for you guys, is peace the absence of evidence? I know a lot of college students are into the peace movement, right? They're anti-war. But just because there is no war, it does not follow that there is peace. Was there war in the antebellum South, where the slavery was there, but there was no war? We had an unjust society. You couldn't have peace without it. The claim, and I think it was the correct claim even if it was the facts were wrong, but remember, no justice, no peace. I've been saying that for years, right? If there is no justice, there is no peace, right? And so that is the ultimate goal when it comes to natural law, is justice, from which we will get peace. And we can operate within natural law to create a just war theory that says there are times when we can go to war, and then there are ways to conduct ourselves when we go to war, with the ultimate goal of justice, and from that we get peace. All right, let's see if we got one more. That's it. So that would conclude this lecture on this. And from here, we want to apply not only natural law to war as I did today, we can apply it to sexual ethics, we can apply it to politics, to gun rights legislation, right? So this isn't merely a lecture to give you a way to determine whether war is just or not. This is a means or an opening to discuss whether or not any action is just or not. So let's keep that in mind, and we'll open it up for discussion here. Now we can